After debate, debt ceiling discussions broke down last Friday, Republican negotiators resumed talks with the Biden White House this morning, setting the stage for a meeting between House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden set to begin shortly. With an early June deadline looming, Republicans remain united, but the president doesn't seem to be moving. What's next? Well, joining me now to discuss this and more is Congressman Bob Good. He serves on the House Budget Committee and the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. He represents the 5th Congressional District of Virginia. Congressman Good, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you again, Tony. Thanks for having me.
So Speaker McCarthy's meeting with the president is expected to begin shortly. What are you hearing?
Well, the main point, Tony, is that the House has done its job, and the only thing left to happen is for the Senate to pass our bill and the president to sign it. And what our message is to the Speaker, we're behind him. But the House Freedom Caucus, as you know, put out our official position on Friday, reiterating the fact that we came together over the last 90 days to negotiate a debt ceiling increase. Most Republicans did not want to increase the debt limit at all. Most Republicans had never voted for a debt ceiling increase. However, we came together after 90 days while the Senate and the White House were MIA, missing in action on the sidelines, nowhere to be found, predicting failure in the House. Meanwhile, House Republicans came together with significant cuts, structural reforms that would put us on a path towards fiscal responsibility in exchange for a modest, by DC standards, debt ceiling increase. Quite frankly, the only negotiation should be when the Senate is going to pass the bill to avoid any consequence of reaching the debt limit, and the president should sign it and not risk any consequence to the country.
So, Congressman Good, that raises a good question. How long has the Senate had the House bill that the House passed?
We are coming up on, I think, about 25 days since the House did its job, and we sent that bill to the Senate. There was no reason for them to sit on it. As you know, led by the great Mike Lee from Utah, you had 43 senators sign a written statement saying they support the House bill, which means Chuck Schumer has no option. He can't pass anything out of the Senate that doesn't cut spending. You have a couple of more Republican senators who verbally have pledged to join that effort. So we're somewhere in the range of 45. We only need 40, as you know, to hold the line, or 41, I should say, to prevent the Senate from being able to pass anything with filibuster. So the Senate has no option but to pass the House bill. We have the first opportunity in modern times, Tony, to force real cuts in spending, real structural reforms to put us on a path again to fiscal responsibility. Kevin McCarthy can be a historic speaker that stared down the Democrats, that stared down the White House, made them cave, and we should not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We need to use the leverage and the power we have by the success of the House of Representatives in passing this bill and force the Democrats and the Senate to pass it.
You know, Bob, all that you say is correct. But I want to emphasize that what's been proposed by the House is by no means drastic. I mean, this is simply going back to the budget numbers of 2022, which are, frankly, elevated in and of themselves. But the president wants even more.
Yes, there's not going to be a default unless we continue on the current track and we continue this reckless spending, and we can no longer borrow and service our debt or pay our debt. That would be a future default. In the immediacy here, we don't need to fear some kind of catastrophic consequence. We're spending about $100 billion a month more than we're taking in. If the Senate does not follow the House leadership and pass this bill, it would force a reduction in spending of about $100 billion a month. Quite frankly, who cares if we don't fund the WHO or the NIH or the UN or the promotion of LGBTQ around the world? There's more than enough revenue to pay the interest on the debt, to pay for the VA, to pay for our national defense, to pay for Social Security and Medicare. It would simply force prioritization of spending, of payments, I should say, and the Democrats will not abide by that. So we need to force them to pass the House bill because they won't be able to fund all their pet projects because they won't be able to borrow anymore to do that.
In other words, government should focus on what it's supposed to do.
Exactly right.
Let me ask you this question, because the president, I don't do this gleefully, but the president is not being straightforward with the American people in all of these discussions. You know, he's often talking about how he's cut the deficit. Well, that's because we didn't have Congress renew a $1.9 trillion relief bill. I mean, that's the only reason we've seen some reduction in his debt-fueled spending. But he said that he's offered $1 trillion in cuts in these negotiations. That's not true.
No, sir, but this is the same president, as you know, who says he has secured the border. This is the same president who has said that the Afghanistan withdrawal was a great success. And this is the same president who has claimed credit for reducing the deficit just because we didn't have quite as much spending in year two coming out of COVID as in year one. However, he proposed a record $7 trillion budget this year. So if we passed his budget, we would have the greatest deficit in the history of the country. But you're right. No Democrat, and certainly not this president, is proposing any spending cuts. What he wants to do is to raise taxes by $1 trillion over the next 10 years, and he's calling that deficit reduction. But as you know, if we raise taxes, we're going to disincentivize the right things in our economy, and we're not going to realize that revenue anyway.
Well, again, Congressman Bob Good, I commend the Republicans for standing firm. First time I've seen this in my 20 years of being this close to Congress and the work that they do. So I commend the Republicans for sticking together. I want to switch topics here before we run out of time. This week, the House is slated to vote on a Congressional Review Act resolution that you put forward that would roll back the vote buying, what I call a vote buying scheme by the president to get the votes of the youth, those who have college debt, the student loan forgiveness plan. Tell us about it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The president, on the eve of the election, announced his student loan transfer scheme to make those who didn't borrow hundreds of billions of dollars have to pay the student loans of others who did borrow that. But thankfully, you got to go back about 25 years to the Newt Gingrich days, 1996, 27 years ago, where there was a law passed by Congress where a major rule or regulation that comes out can be reviewed by Congress, overturned by Congress. So we're not waiting on the Supreme Court to see if they'll overturn the student loan transfer scheme, but we're taking action as a Congress. I think this will pass out of the House this week. Then the Senate has to take it up, and hopefully there'll be tremendous public pressure on the Senate to pass it, on those somewhat professing moderates, a couple of senators in the Senate to join House Republicans in passing this, and then hopefully tremendous public pressure on President Biden to sign it.
Just a technical question for you, Bob. Does this require 60 votes to move through the Senate?
I don't believe so. I believe it takes just a simple majority on it.
Well, it has a real chance then of actually passing. Congressman Bob Good, always great to see you. Thanks for fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Tony. Again, it's great to be with you.